October 17th, 1943, 22:15 hours. A rented room, Ypsilanti, Michigan. The air was damp and smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap American cigarettes. For Erich Lehmann, a man who officially did not exist, this smell was the odor of his exile. He was an engineer by trade, a graduate of the Technische Universität Berlin. His hands, which longed for the precision of a micrometer, were stained with the grease of a local diner's kitchen. He was, in his mind, a patriot, an Abwehr agent deep in the industrial heartland of the enemy, a vital, unseen cog in the German war machine. His mission: to report on the arsenal of democracy. His reports to Berlin for the past year had been a source of comfort to his handlers. He detailed the chaos, the strikes, the appalling lack of craftsmanship, the social pandemonium. He wrote of the Americans as a mongrel nation, a collection of shopkeepers and gangsters incapable of the high-minded, state-run industrial perfection of the Reich. He had especially focused on the joke that was the new Ford bomber plant, a project so plagued by incompetence it was known locally as Willow Run. But tonight his confidence was a cold, dead thing. Spread across his small table, illuminated by a single bare bulb, were blueprints. Not blueprints of the factory, but something far more terrifying: a production schedule. A schedule he had paid a drunk, disgruntled foreman $50 for. He stared at the numbers, his engineer's mind tracing the columns, running the calculations again and again. They were not just optimistic. They were not just ambitious. They were insane. They were a lie. They had to be. He put on his coat and drove his rusted Ford coupe down a dark, unpaved road. He parked on a hill overlooking the facility. It wasn't a factory. It was a city. A sprawling 3.5 million square foot monster, blazing with light under the vast Michigan darkness. Its mile-long assembly building stretching into infinity, and next to it an airfield, its tarmac gleaming. He pulled out his binoculars and began to count the new, unpainted B-24 Liberators sitting on the hardstand, fresh from the line. He counted them, checked his watch, and made a calculation based on the foreman's schedule. A cold, profound terror, a dread far deeper than any fear of the FBI, seized him. The numbers weren't a lie. The factory was not producing one bomber a day. It was not producing one bomber every 4 hours. The number on the schedule, the number that was now his only reality, was one per hour. He suddenly realized the war was not about soldiers. It was about this, and Germany was already lost. In 1941, as America's entry into the war became an inevitability, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a colossal strategic problem. He had promised to be the arsenal of democracy, but his Air Force was a shadow. The war would be fought across 2 oceans, and it demanded a new kind of weapon, a truly long-range, heavy bomber. The Boeing B-17 was a masterpiece, but the consolidated B-24 Liberator, with its innovative high-aspect ratio Davis wing, was its equal, and in one crucial metric, its superior. It had the range. It could fly farther, carry a heavier bomb load, and was more adaptable. It was the perfect weapon for the Pacific Theater and for the U-boat hunting gap in the mid-Atlantic. But there was a problem. The B-24 was a product of craft manufacturing. At Consolidated's plant in San Diego, each 30-ton bomber was built by hand, by teams of master craftsmen. They were built like bespoke suits, not factory-line products. The process was slow, complex, and agonizing. Each B-24 required over 200,000 man-hours to complete. At this rate, the U.S. Army Air Forces would be lucky to get a few hundred a year. They needed tens of thousands. The U.S. government turned to the only industry on Earth that understood scale: the Detroit automotive giants. In 1941, Charles Lindbergh, acting as a government consultant, helped broker a meeting between the Army and the most feared and respected production genius on the planet, Charles "Cast Iron Charlie" Sorensen, the ruthless vice president of the Ford Motor Company. Sorensen flew to the San Diego plant. He watched the craftsmen carefully, slowly, meticulously hand-riveting the wings and fuselage. He watched for less than a day. He then turned to the Consolidated executives, his face a mask of contempt. "This is not a production line," he allegedly scoffed. "This is a custom tailor shop." The executives asked him how he would do it. Sorensen, the man who had birthed the Model T assembly line, gave an answer that would define the entire war. "We'll build it just like we build the Model B. We'll build one an hour." The aviation industry laughed. The German high command, when they heard of it, laughed. It was an arrogant, impossible boast. For Mary Kotecki, a 19-year-old from a pig farm in rural Ohio, The journey to Willow Run in 1943 was like traveling to another planet. Her husband, Sam, was in the Pacific, a Marine on an island she couldn't pronounce. A government poster of a woman in a bandana, flexing her muscle, had told her, "We can do it." So she had packed one small suitcase and taken a 14-hour bus ride to Ypsilanti, Michigan. The reality of the arsenal of democracy was a chaotic, muddy, 16-hour-a-day hell. The factory was a man-made wonder, but the town itself was a human catastrophe. The area, unequipped for the 42,000 workers who had descended on it, became a sprawling, overcrowded slum of trailers, tents, and hastily built dormitories. It had a grim local nickname, Will It Run, as in will it run or won't it? She was assigned a cot in a dormitory with 15 other women, the shift so constant that the bed was never cold. Her job was a testament to the Ford philosophy. Mary had never held anything more complex than a hoe. In 6 weeks, she was trained to be a Class C riveter. She was not a master craftsman. She did not build a plane. She performed one task. She stood in the deafening cavernous wing assembly jig, and for 12 hours she bucked rivets on the port side aileron attachment. The noise of thousands of rivet guns was a physical concussive force that she felt in her teeth. The foremen were brutal, pushing for the quota for the bomber an hour. In that first year, the plant was a disaster. The line broke down. Parts manufactured by Ford wouldn't fit with parts from Consolidated. The worker turnover was 390%. But Mary stayed. She stayed because the photograph of Sam in her locker was a constant reminder. She was not bucking a rivet. She was loading a bullet. The pressure was immense, the work was soul-crushing, and the conditions were abysmal. But she and 40,000 others were being forged by Cast-Iron Charlie into a new kind of army, one the Germans had never anticipated. In Berlin, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Reich Air Ministry, operated on a philosophy of pure arrogant confidence. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, a man who famously dismissed American industry, had set the tone. The Americans are good at refrigerators and razor blades. They can't build combat aircraft. It's a matter of handwork. This was the core of the German industrial belief. Handwork, craftsmanship. To the German engineering mind, an aircraft was a high-performance, temperamental racehorse. It could only be built by master craftsmen in specialized factories with meticulous state-supervised care. A Heinkel He-111 or a Junkers Ju-88 was a piece of industrial art. The idea of a nation of shopkeepers and jazz-playing decadents applying their crude, commercial mass-production techniques to something as complex as a 4-engine heavy bomber was, to them, laughable. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was more pragmatic. But even he was a prisoner of this doctrine. German production was built on quality and perfection. This led to incredibly advanced weapons like the Tiger tank and the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. But it also meant their production lines were slow, complex, and inflexible. They could not comprehend the American philosophy of good enough in overwhelming numbers. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, spies in America, like Erich Lehmann, were sent to confirm this bias. Their mission was to find the flaws. And in 1942 and early 1943, their reports were gleefully correct. They reported on the chaos at Will It Run. They detailed the high turnover, the faulty parts, the strikes. They told Berlin that the Ford plant was a boondoggle, a perfect example of American capitalist inefficiency. The German High Command read these reports, nodded, and focused their attention on the Eastern Front, confident that the arsenal of democracy would collapse under its own childish, chaotic weight. They expected failure. What the German spies saw as chaos was, in fact, the brutal, agonizing birth of an industrial revolution. By mid-1943, Charles Sorensen had broken the back of the problem. He had not built a factory. He had built a machine. And the action was this machine in motion. It began not in the mile-long assembly hall, but in the foundry, where massive, 500-ton stamping presses, the same ones that had stamped out Ford V8 fenders, were now pounding out B-24 wing ribs and fuselage formers with a deafening, rhythmic ka-chunk. This was the first heresy the aviation world had dismissed. The main hall was the cathedral of this new religion. It was not one assembly line, but two, running in parallel over a mile long. The sheer, overwhelming scale was the weapon. A B-24 bomber has 1.2 million parts. Ford's genius was in breaking its construction down into 86 separate, simple, timed stations. The sequence was relentless. At the far end, 3 massive sub-assemblies, the nose, the tail, and the 110-foot-long main wing, were built on their own parallel lines. An overhead crane, the largest in the world, would lift the 10-ton wing and mate it with the center fuselage. This was Station 1, then the clock started. The entire skeletal aircraft began to move. It was the Ford line writ large. It crawled down the track at 6 feet per minute. At each station, a new team swarmed it. Station 10. A team of Rosies like Mary Kotecki would swarm the wing roots, their rivet guns a deafening chatter, stitching the aluminum skin. Station 25. Electricians, nicknamed Sparks, would feed the 10 miles of wiring harness through the fuselage. Station 40. The four 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines, built by Buick and Chevrolet, were lowered from an overhead conveyor and bolted to the wing. Station 60. The plexiglass nose cone was fitted. The hydraulic lines for the landing gear were filled and bled. Station 86. The final station. The turrets, nose, tail, top, and ball were dropped in. The plane was complete. It rolled off the line across a massive turnaround and onto the second line, which ran a mile back. This was the finishing line. Here it was painted, the systems were tested, and it was filled with fuel. It rolled off the line, out the massive big doors, onto the tarmac, its engines ready for their first test flight. And right behind it, emerging from the big doors just 63 minutes later, was the next one. And the next? It was not a factory. It was a river of bombers. The impossible boast of 1 bomber per hour was achieved in the spring of 1944. The joke of Willow Run had become the terror of Willow Run. The numbers were the weapon that broke the German. Mind you, 1942. A total of 56 B-24s were produced as the plant struggled. June 1943. Production was 228 planes per month. The German Abwehr reports were still focused on this clumsy rate. December 1943, 416 planes per month. April 1944, the peak. The plant produced 455 B-24s. That is 1 B-24 every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This was the shock that Eric Lehman, the spy, was reporting. His frantic coded cables to Berlin were no longer dismissed. They were now terrifying. The numbers were incomprehensible. At its peak, the Willow Run plant by itself was producing more 4-engine bombers than the entire combined aircraft industries of Germany and Japan. The Junkers factories, under constant Allied bombing, were struggling to produce 100 Ju-188s a month. Willow Run was churning out 450. The Germans had expected their superior craft to be the decisive factor. They believed the Ford-built planes would be shoddy and fall apart. They were crude. They were nicknamed the Flying Boxcar and the Crate. They were drafty and hard to fly. But they worked. They flew. They carried their bombs, and there were thousands of them. The unexpected outcome was that the Model B philosophy had not just worked. It had created an avalanche of steel that would bury the Axis. The psychological impact of Willow Run was not felt by the German soldier on the front line, who only saw an endless black sky of bombers. It was felt in the one office in Berlin where the truth could not be hidden, the office of Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer was an industrialist. He was an architect. He understood logistics, raw materials, and man-hours. When Lehman's reports crossed his desk, he did not react like Goering with bluster and denial. He reacted like an engineer who had just been checkmated. He knew what it took to build one Heinkel He 177. He knew the man-hours, the alloys, the factory space. When he saw the figures from Willow Run, he knew with cold mathematical certainty that the war was lost. He wrote in his memoirs, "I saw the reports of American production. I saw that in 1 year they were producing on a scale we could never ever match. Not in 100 years. That was the day I knew the war was over." This was the true shock. The war was not a matter of will or spirit or craft. It was a war of spreadsheets. It was a war of logistics. And the Germans, with their meticulous, masterful handwork, were bringing a single jeweled sword to a fight against a machine that was endlessly firing steel ingots. The Luftwaffe pilot who shot down a B-24 over Ploesti was a hero, but his victory was statistically meaningless. Willow Run had already replaced that plane, and the 10 others lost on that same mission, all before his Focke-Wulf had even landed and refueled. The futility was absolute. Willow Run produced 8,685 B-24 Liberators. The arsenal of democracy was not a metaphor. It was a 3.5 million square foot building in Michigan. The B-24s from that one factory formed the backbone of the strategic air war. They were the VLR, very long-range Liberators that flew from Iceland and Newfoundland, closing the black gap in the mid-Atlantic and driving the U-boat wolf packs from the sea. They were the planes that flew the suicidal low-level mission to destroy the Plosti oil fields in Romania, crippling the Wehrmacht's fuel supply. They were the planes that flew over the hump from India to China, keeping the Pacific War alive. And they were the planes that flew wing-to-wing with the B-17s, turning cities like Hamburg and Berlin into oceans of rubble. The German spies were shocked because they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, total industrial warfare. They saw a nation they had mocked as decadent and unfocused convert its consumer muscle into the most terrifying, efficient war machine in human history. The war was won by the courage of the soldier, but it was made possible by the Rosie the Riveters, like Mary Kotecki, the ruthless genius of cast-iron Charlie Sorensen, and the mile-long, thundering, relentless river of steel that was Willow Run.